a very good evening to all the attendees and to our speaker, Dr. Anurag Agarwal, who has joined us today on this fourth day of the Science Academy's online lecture workshop on Frontiers in Science and Engineering, Opportunities for Graduate. And this workshop is being supported by all the three science academies: Indian Academy of Sciences, Bangalore; the National Academy of Sciences, India, Allahabad; and the Indian National Science Academy, New Delhi. Professor Anurag Sharma is the convener of the workshop, who is a GC Bose National Fellow and is at Department of Physics, IIT Delhi. And as in all the sessions, the audience are from diverse area. So I'll briefly introduce about the previous workshops which we have organized in last 10 years. So first one was in 2011. There was a lecture workshop on frontiers in physics. Then 2012, in frontiers in science and engineering. And the third one was again on lecture workshops on history, aspects and prospects of electronics in India in 2012. Thereafter, we invited the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar awardees, and there were 4 transdisciplinary areas of research and teaching lecture workshops. The first one in 2013, followed by in 2015, 17, and 19. In this workshop, we have 12 speakers, and this is the 4th day. And we have 2 talks in the biological sciences session. First one is by Dr. Anurag Agarwal, who's the director, CSIR Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology. And the second talk is by Dr. Rakesh K. Mishra, who's a CSIR director, Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology from Hyderabad. He'll be joining with us around 6:45 or so. So before I hand over to Dr. Anurag Agarwal for his talk, let me briefly introduce him, who's a physician, scientist, and the director of the Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology, a CSIR institution, and is known for his studies on lung diseases. Dr. Agarwal is a senior DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance Fellow. He received the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize, the highest Indian Science Award, for his contribution to medical sciences in 2014, as well as the National Bioscience Award for Career Development in 2015. As the head of the National Laboratory and as an elected fellow of both the major National Science Academies of India, he is deeply engaged with the science society interface and biomedical policy development. His current focus areas include the use of information technology and big data analytics for the effective application of community health efforts and the development of pattern-based diagnostics. His group has also developed integrated solutions for healthcare delivery and digital data collection in resource-limited settings, as well as computational tools for visualization and analysis of complex medical datasets. With these words, I welcome Dr. Agarwal, and I request him to kindly share his screen.
Thank you very much.
To deliver his talk.
Thank you very much, Manoj.
Thank you, sir.
Let me get my screen on. And thank you for the kind introduction. Can you all see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. And when I was asked regarding what I would like to speak to this audience on, I was trying to find something that would be of interest to a majority of people. And in the time of COVID-19, given a mix of people with biological and non-biological background, I thought perhaps I would talk about Indian healthcare, the ongoing digital transformation of the country, and COVID-19 and how things are changing. And let me see, yeah, here we go. As you all know, you're living in a very, very digital world. Many of you who are young are actually digital natives who may have never even seen a film camera. What you basically realize is that digital life has changed so much, but health has more or less. If I look at healthcare today, it's not very, very different from what it was when I was a medical student in 1989. So clearly health is ripe for transformation. And our Prime Minister, in his speech on 15th August, made a very important announcement, which was preceded by the announcement by the Finance Minister in May 2020 of the National Digital Health Authority. Now, what brought this about? As you know, India has made huge progress in becoming a digital nation. Some of you, the ones who pay taxes, realize how different India's tax paying system is compared to the rest of the world. Aadhaar has been a game changer in India. Any one of us can simply go, use a biometric ID, and immediately get something tagged to our national ID. So how would this work in the future when we try to build on this thing that we sometimes call the India stack, an entire redesigned vision of health in the country? And there were three promises made by the Prime Minister. Our healthcare records will be digitized. Guidelines for treatment would be standardized, which means that you would not be treated in 25 different ways if you visited 25 different places. And you would have easy access to your own health records using something called a health ID. And all this became part of a national digital health mission. It was proposed, well, it took a long time coming, but only in 2019 was the main draft out for review. And within 1 year, it has become reality. When we speak about the general rate of progress of digital tools in general in healthcare, this is amazingly fast. So what happened? What catalyzed this rapid transformation towards digital health? And does COVID-19 have anything to do with it? So we'll talk about some of these things as we go forward. So I'm borrowing some graph from a recent publication that I'd written about bridging digital health divides in a country like India and how COVID-19 is accelerating digital health transformation. Now, these pictures on the top would be familiar to you. On the top left, you have doctors sitting outside in a tree, looking at a large number of patients and prescribing out medications quickly. If you go towards the inpatient care setting, things are not very, very different in terms of crowds, in terms of the way things are done. And you can clearly see this is not a digital setting. This is purely analog. If you were to think of what we could do in such a setting with so many people, you probably are not looking at anything more than digitization, which basically means at least maintain a digital record of what is done. So analog data to digital records, and that is digitization. If you were to try to improve the process flow inside the hospital, you might find that rather than having everything on paper, if things could move conveniently and smoothly, and you could have access to the patient's record and investigations by typing onto a computer, and all the data would be connected to each other such that the person, by first being seen in this clinic as an outpatient, then coming to the hospital later, you would have some access to what the previous doctor found regarding their symptoms. That would be digitization. And clearly, when you look at private hospitals, and I have a picture of a corporate hospital down here, a large degree of digitalization has already occurred. But what we are really looking for in the Indian vision of the National Digital Health Mission is transformation. And what do I mean by transformation? The same thing that our Prime Minister promised us, but most importantly, a complete integration of your digital lives with other things. And that is something that is extremely important in terms of how to do things in the future. So let's talk a little bit about the most obvious low-hanging fruit in the world of digital health. And there's a very nice story here. If anybody wants to read it, I put the link at the bottom. The history of telemedicine in India. Telemedicine in India actually is pretty old. As far back as the year 2000, when the internet was still young, ISRO, working with Apollo hospitals, used satellite-based communications to provide healthcare services to villages. By 2005, India had already set up an entire commission to look at how telemedicine can be expanded. And what better country to do this than India? The majority of our people live outside the cities. The majority of our doctors live inside the cities. So if you want to create any equitable match, and you can understand it is challenging to create the situation that will attract doctors to the periphery, you have to use technology. And telemedicine, by which either clinical or radiological investigations can be transferred over distances, is one of the easiest ways of doing it. And given India's capacity with satellites, given India's ability with IT, India was already in the middle of an IT revolution in Y2K. This was something India was always capable of doing. But there were challenges. And the challenges are not always technological. The challenges can be of mindset. The only people who took up telemedicine very easily and comfortably were radiologists. Why them? Because they anyway work with digital images. And they had a business model. In this business model, they could now install imaging machines, CT scanners, into a periphery, and their radiologists, who may not have wanted to go to the periphery, would continue living in the cities where they were, and the images would come to them. Not only this, it was a good business model for international services as well. Many Indian radiologists started serving other countries. People trained in the US used to come back and they could continue to serve US hospitals while from India using time zone differences. When it's night in America, it's still day in India. So telemedicine became mostly teleradiology, and of course, every department in the country of major hospitals did develop some telemedicine capacity, but there was one fundamental problem. The workflow is not fundamentally digital in specialties other than radiology. Pathology, which can be made digital, was mostly not yet digital, and a pathological image is in color. It's a massive amount of data, unlike most radiological images, which are black and white and are very little data. And the type of bandwidth India had developed at that point in time was not sufficient. If you wanted to have a video interview with a patient, the bandwidth was simply not enough. I remember the early 2000s when trying to get a 512K connection required, making a huge number of phone calls and favors, and that to a stable line. So it took some time to mature, but in the last decade, we have seen 3G, 4G, and now 5G about to come. We have seen fiber optic, we have seen broadband. Now in many of you who live in cities, a speed of 200 Mbps is usual, at least not in South Delhi, not in Bangalore, not in Mumbai. And that has really promoted the possibility of telemedicine in the country. In this background, the government has also been very active. There is something called eSanjeevani, built by CDAC Mohali, in which you can have an entire telemedicine consult. The problem, as usual, has been uptake. And that's where COVID came in. So if you look at eSanjeevani, you could see that everybody was aware the platform existed. It was a good platform. You actually had a waiting room. In the waiting room, you would go wait for a doctor to see you. Some states had actually hired telemedicine specialists, and the possibility was always there. But the feel of actually visiting a doctor, the expectations of both the doctor and the patient continued that people would travel long distances with great difficulty, even to get a 2-minute consultation in real life from a doctor, when they could have gained 80% of the situation, the same advice, over telemedicine. And this is where COVID had a dramatic effect. After SARS-CoV-2 pandemic started spreading across the world, you realize that one of the first fatalities were in doctors. Healthcare workers who were previously reluctant to make the investment, to spend the time, because if you actually look at it, if you remember that first picture I showed you of 20 patients sitting around a doctor, each showing themselves one by one very quickly, while there is no sense of privacy, it's very efficient. In 2 minutes, you can be done with a patient and move on to the next one. Contrast that with a digital consult. Only one person will enter at a time. It takes sometimes some effort to get everything started. Sometimes the connection breaks. You have to do it all over again. It's actually more difficult at times. And the investment from the side of either the patient or the doctor was not really there. Fear drove the adoption of telemedicine and telehealth in India from March. A few years ago, there was a case in the Bombay High Court in which the judgment, the way it came out, was against the doctor because the court felt the doctor did not sufficiently examine the patient before prescribing the medication. I will not debate the merits of that case or the decision, but the point is, because a digital consultation was used, the entire field became afraid that perhaps your liability would be very high. So fear of one time can only sometimes be beaten by fear of another time. And what we saw is a huge rise in digital consultations using eSanjeevani and many other applications during the COVID-19. So soon after the March 23, when the lockdown was announced, we finally got the national telemedicine guidelines within a few days of the lockdown being announced. I'm not trying to say the guidelines were made in a few days. The guidelines had already been made. They were waiting for approval for a while. And clearly, when you lock down a country and prevent people from going outside, it does become imperative to quickly clear all those things that were waiting for clearances. So all of you know about Arogya Setu. What people don't often know about is Arogya Setu Mitra. So if Arogya Setu told you that you have COVID, you might need to be tested and gave you many other things, it also gave you links. It gave you links for online consultations. It gave you links for online medications. It gave you links for home lab testing. The consultations were free. The medicines were not. The testing was not. And this was working quite well for the first few months during the COVID pandemic. But it has been withdrawn now, partially because it created a conflict of interest in the perception of some people that a government app, Arogya Setu, was linking out to a web portal that was not completely government operated and was linking out to private players providing online medications and home lab testing. Now, I'm an optimist. I actually think it was a good idea. Of course, the legality of it is not clear to me. But brick and mortar shops, which were closed during that time, once they opened, they pointed out that an unfair advantage was being given. And they requested the Delhi High Court to intervene. And soon after that, the government stopped Arogya Setu Mitra. This story somewhat shows both the opportunities and the challenges created by COVID-19 in digital transformation. Now, if you think about it in one way, would you like the ability to access free online consultations from an app that tracks your symptoms and get your medication and lab testing delivered for free in a manner in which the government has at least looked into the people being put on the portal? Many people might say yes. But is it equally fair to all businesses? Is it something that creates advantage to some people and not to other people? Does it go against the small shops that are the bedrock of our economy? Well, that sounds right too. So digital transformation is a painful process. It sounds nice. It is probably good for the nation in the long run. But over a short time, it creates massive turmoil in the economy. We are seeing it not only in health. You're seeing it for Amazon. You're seeing it for Flipkart. You're seeing it with the local grocery providers. You hear many shops, the local Bania shop, people would like to say, I'm a Bania, so I can use the word. And those shops are shutting down because people have shifted towards online delivery. So these things are challenging. They completely change the way society works. They create a new set of privileged and disprivileged. They fundamentally can change how the economy, the employment, the entire system would work. And health is no different from anything else. But the opportunities are massive, as I will talk in my next few slides. And while we do all this, we must remember that while India is one of the largest smartphone using nations in the world, that is simply because of the size of our population. Not every Indian has a smartphone. Many families have only one smartphone. That one smartphone is often kept with the male of the house and not accessible to the females or the children. So the male might be out and somebody who needs to access some help may not have any access to a smartphone. So it was very pleasing, at least to me, to see how Project Step 1, which basically was Indian strength in call handling, call centers, in handling 21, 30 different languages, people coming together under the Invest India platform, the Agni platform, investing ideas of multiple science agencies, creating Project Step 1, where on a simple phone call, you could get access to first an IVRS type of a system, where you would simply punch the right number and get some relevant advice. And if you required a medical consultation in your own language, you could get it. More than 100,000 patients were being seen per day at its peak. And that is something that's absolutely unique. I mean, no other country in the world has to cater to 30 different languages, 100,000 phone calls, people wanting advice, many people not necessarily with a very high level of education. And that is a very good example of how digital transformation in India has to be a little bit different from the same thing elsewhere in the world. And the basic point of all this is that it is okay to borrow concepts, but it is equally important to modify these concepts to the local context. And digital health is far more than telemedicine. So far, I've been focusing a little bit on that, or it's the lowest hanging fruit. But when you generate the data, can you also use the same data you're collecting by serving the people to guide your strategy? Can you have molecular and digital surveillance, I'm sorry for the typo over there, also become part of digital transformation? After all, the sequence of a virus is digital. All the data coming out of sequencers is digital. The future vision of digital health is not really about telemedicine. It's about massive amounts of digital data of a variety of types and using it for better quality healthcare. So if we were to talk about, let's say, two areas, surveillance and prediction, something that I was looking after for PSA's office and also for CSIR. Surveillance could be of the virus. It could be of the number of infections. It could be of the response of the human host in India to the infection. The prediction could be about the future, about the changes in the virus, about the spread of infections, about the course of infections, its modifiers, who's going to have a bad outcome, who is not. All this is not possible unless you have digital transformation. All type of digital data seamlessly flowing together onto digital platforms where people experienced in analytics and informatics can work upon the data, provide ideas, provide insights to policymakers, to doctors, to people of India. And here is an example of work of Professor Kamakoti from IIT Madras, who works on the Citizens app, which is Arogya Setu. He could use the data coming out of people typing in their symptoms, of the data being collected by ICMR to build maps at district level. He could look at trends in combination with actual RT-PCR data. He could look at the percent positive tests coming out of this country, and he could build hotspots at the level of cities, at the level of neighborhoods, at the level of nations. And further, by using call tracing, you could find out where an infected person had traveled through. You could identify areas where the exposure might be high. And today, when we are doing on the ground field testing, these things can guide how we go around testing. The samples, which are turning out to be simply positive or negative on the ICMR database, many of them were sent to institutes like mine, where they were sequenced. We could identify the various jumps. We could identify the movement of various strains into India. I'll not speak too much about that today. That's kind of beyond what my real topic is here. But we could see the waves. We could see super spreading events. We could simulate the mutations observed in the virus. We saw the D614G. None of them revealed any strain likely to be much worse clinically. We knew the ones who were symptomatic. We knew the ones that were asymptomatic. More than 2,000 genomes have been sequenced within CSIR. More than 1,000 genomes have been sequenced, of viruses, of course, by DBT. Hundreds of patients for whom we have all data, starting from host response, so basically RNA sequencing of the human host, the viral data, the clinical data, radiological data is all available now. I wish the number was in thousands, not in hundreds, but at least it's a good start. We did see a few potentially weakening mutations. Some of them you already heard about are now dying out, all being replaced by D614G. And we found that models that were based on true digital modeling, based on data coming from the globe, were far more accurate than models coming out of classical SEIR models, which basically use R0, they use the susceptible people, the infected people, the recovered people, and reason being we knew so little about the virus. So classical models work best when the parameters are well understood. While many of the data-driven models that don't make too many assumptions, they can sometimes do a better job because they're more hypothesis-free. And various kind of work has been done as part of this facet of digital transformation. And the government has been informed as well. There is a work that's called Itihas, which is again done by Professor Kamakoti's team, in which they can create what they call pink spots. Red spots, as you know, are red zones, are by ICMR. areas in which you have large number of cases. So pink spots predicted by Dr. Kamapoti were actually areas that are likely to become red but are not yet red. And using these as daily inputs in areas like Ahmedabad, when the epidemic was at its peak, the district administration was able to focus their testing and bring down the number of infected people very rapidly, as shown in the graph on the right. Very sharp decline after this was implemented. I'm going to move a little bit outside COVID now and start generalizing beyond COVID. COVID is only a catalyst, an urgency. It is not in itself a full reason. You can see in the cartoon at the bottom right that all of us thought, at least in India, digital transformation was years away. We didn't see that we would have to make changes anytime very soon. And that wrecking ball that you see to the right is how COVID-19 is changing many of our assumptions. But the basic idea of digital transformation, separate from digitalization, the vision on the right, the top right, is also basically digital. It is not basically that digital is not there. You can see the cell phones are working, the mobile phones are working, the genome sequencing is working, but things are not integrated. While in the bottom left, you can see there is a cocoon that covers everything, making smooth flow of data. We'll come back to that a little while later when I talk about a book from the chairman of the Tata Group about a digital nation. But most importantly, digital transformation is about evolution. Every picture I show you over here is some kind of stethoscope or an equivalent thing. You can see over hundreds of years, the simple act of hearing sounds to figure out what is happening in the lungs has changed. In the beginning, you had little flute-like things, wooden things. Then you have what all of you will recognize. And now you have these little portable ultrasound machines that don't exactly listen to sound in the conventional way, but they use sound waves to create imaging of the lung. And all of these are being accelerated by COVID. If you were to look at how doctors listen to patients' lungs in the past history, you can see this doctor is going to get infected by COVID very, very fast. And even these electronic stethoscopes, the way I show at the bottom, would not prevent all the problems from happening. While an ultrasound probe held next to the chest could provide these images, could fundamentally go into telemedicine and AI, and could lead to diagnosis, all these sharp lines that you see, if you see these lines in a lung of a patient suspected to have COVID, you can almost diagnose the person to have COVID. These are called POCUS, point of care ultrasound. It sounds like a bit of a hocus pocus, but this is all reality. In fact, around the world, people are using these small little things that are, you can, if you look at the picture, that small compared to an iPad or an Android, you can just put it on the lung and you can have a very nice sense of whether the person has lung involvement. But all these products typically take years to reach the market. And the reason is you have to undergo technical validation, you go through evidence, you go through regulatory clearances, you go through awareness and credibility, and then you find a commercial model. What basically has happened with COVID is these steps have become faster. So for those of you who are chemists, it's the same reaction energy, but the activation energy has come down. So the hump is lower and a little bit of less effort is sometimes sufficient to get it over the hump. So basically what you see is a variety of things in digital health that have already come. Virtual visits, it's happened all the way down to commercial models. Digital symptom checkers, yet they exist and some people are paying for them. Remote patient monitoring, they're happening. Not that many commercial models, but still, it's already happening. Digital disease management, many doctors in India are now doing digital consultations. Digital pharmacies, in fact, I would argue that for some time, digital pharmacies were doing more business than brick and mortar pharmacies. Digital therapeutics, not yet there. We haven't really got to the point where your entire treatment would be made by AI machines. China, for example, and China has big differences in terms of implementation difficulties compared to democracies, and I'm not even saying that is the right approach. But China used AI in a massive way. It was using thermal cameras in public areas. It was using face recognition to identify people who were not supposed to be outside. It was using AI and CT scanners to scan people when RT-PCRs were delayed. And I'll give you actual pictures of what it looks like later on. So there's going to be tremendous impact of this kind of digital health on healthcare in the coming years. Those of you old enough to know about Braithwaite, To Serve with Love, might have read this book, To Siri with Love. It's a wonderful book talking about how an autistic child finds it easier to talk to Siri and gain information and learn conversation than talking to humans. And I'm very sure that during isolation, many people found such conversation useful. So what type of care can digital health change? Face-to-face, by telemedicine, medical chatbots. One side is a computer, one side is a human. And the true future of healthcare, digital twins and continuous surveillance. All of us could have continuous monitoring of our health parameters without even thinking about it. This digital version of ours exists only in the virtual world, is continuously being analyzed by algorithms that exist in the virtual world. Under normal circumstances, all this medicine is happening, we don't even know about it. But if something happens that is worth bringing to our notice, this digital interaction crosses over to the real world and we get alarmed. So, or either we or our physicians get an alarm telling us that something needs to be done. So healthcare is going to change in massive ways in time to come. And it'll take care of many of the typical patients, of the typical patient concerns. And these are the typical patient concerns. Eric Topol had a lovely book, The Patient Will See You Now. Today is the world of the doctor will see you now. Everybody will queue up for the doctor to see them. Very soon, it could be the other way around. In a virtual waiting room, the patient could admit a doctor to see them amongst what is available. And I think the world is going to see massive transformation. This is ADA. It's an actual tool. Some of you can download it and try it. It's a symptom checker for a variety of small complaints which don't actually merit a medical consultation. It can dispose of them immediately. The National Health Service in UK actually worked with ADA to deploy these tools for their patients to reduce the burden upon their doctors. Looking at India and the number of people who are visiting doctors for no real good reason, 90% of them being sent back with a vitamin pill and a crocin, you could imagine how a voice-based, not typing-based, a voice-based system, recognizing like the step one, IVRS, or a true smartphone, or some kiosk, India will have to invent different models, could do exactly the same thing for people in rural areas. Even AI in health, the concept is not really new. Most of what we call neural networks, CNN, were invented in 1988. Well, invented is the wrong word. Described in 1988 by Yann LeCun. The word AI itself is from the 1950s by John McCarthy. And he had a very, very different vision of AI compared to what we actually do now. In fact, the idea of medicine and AI is not new. In 1970, this article was written. I'm not going to read it out completely, but they basically thought that in 1970, computing science will augment and sometimes even replace the intellectual function of physicians. Hasn't quite happened yet, but something that is certainly on its way. This conversation, I don't expect you to be able to read it, but it's an actual conversation between a computer and a physician. The physician is, of course, typing it in 1970. And there is an advice being given to the physician based on the arterial blood gas. This is actual work happening in the 1970s. So sometimes, when I speak to people who were around then, who have seen the AI promise in those days, they seem a bit skeptical about what's different this time around. But things are actually very different. What is different is the society is digital. At that time, these were a few examples in a few places. Society was not digital. And now there is massive data. And this, of course, is the famous Kasparov, the brain's last stand, Deep Blue. After that, it is DeepMind. DeepMind beat the world's number 2 player in Go, a much more complicated game in terms of possibilities than chess. Now we are here, AlphaZero. AlphaZero was never even allowed to play a single game with a human player. It was only given the rules, it only played itself, and it beat the world's top-rated program that even grandmasters cannot beat. 64-36-0, only after 4 hours of training itself. Protein folding. people who use computational biology to try to invent drugs. In the competition in 2018, 43 out of 90 tests where only amino acid sequence was given, AlphaFold, Google's version of DeepMind for protein folding, won 25 of the contests. The best human teams only managed to win 3. So with no real human experience, using purely artificial intelligence, neural networks, it's a fundamentally a deep mind system, is a type of a CNN with optimization. It was better than most human teams with decades of experience in how proteins fold. A glimpse of the next 100 years of medicine tells us that massive data crunching will yield formulas useful for clinical purposes, but they cannot be summarized in language. If they can't be summarized in language, then humans can no longer understand them. So they're useful, but they can't be understood by humans. So it's going to be pretty complicated. And it's going to be very interesting. And this is a picture from, again, some work from Google DeepMind or retinal photographs. All of you may have heard about this paper where diabetic retinopathy was diagnosed very effectively by Google DeepMind, as good as the most well-trained ophthalmologists. But what is less talked about? It could also tell you the gender. It could tell you the age. It could tell you whether the person was a smoker. It could tell you the cardiac risk. No human being can tell, well, age you can estimate a little bit, but none of my ophthalmologist friends can tell you the gender by looking, well, they can tell you the gender before looking into the eyes of the person, but they can't tell you the gender by looking at the retina photograph. There are basically 4 types of machine learning, which basically form AI. You can supervise, you can give them things like this, where the labels are already known and the machine learns to provide new labels. You can give it unsupervised, the machine learns something new, a new type of disease, semi-supervised, a bit of both, or reinforcement, where it learns what to do to create a given outcome in a dynamic process. Again, too much to go into today, but all these things will work. So during the time of COVID-19, for example, our group at IGIB has been working on automatic diagnostics of COVID-19 on chest X-rays. We have had good results, but we also found that many algorithms other people from around the world were finding good on their X-rays were not working very well on Indian X-rays. And there's some very interesting reasons. Indian X-rays have something that we call dirty lungs. Highly polluted countries tend to have them. The markings are more prominent. One of the findings in COVID-19 is the markings look prominent. So many negative Indian chest X-rays were being found to be positive by algorithms that had never been trained on Indian datasets. IGIB is actually a validation lab for digital tools in India. And we had some very nice companies sending us algorithms, and they were showing false positives left, right, and center because Indian normal X-rays can sometimes have prominent markings. And if the algorithm has only been trained on Western data, it's a huge problem. So these are genuine problems of digital transformation in a large country like ours that is theoretically data rich, but actually data poor. There is very little local digital data available for data scientists in India. That is something we have to change if we truly want to benefit from digital transformation. And these are examples of how CT scans were used to diagnose COVID-19. That little white thing you see on the black and white is the pneumonia. And that red thing you see on the color pictures is basically the highlighting by the AI systems of where the COVID pneumonia is. And they can give you volume analysis. They can tell you how much of the lung is involved. They can tell you whether the patient is getting worse, patient is getting better. These are serial images on the same patient. AI is doing all the calculation, marking all the areas. It is absolutely amazing. And these are very subtle findings, by the way. Unlike the previous X-rays where the findings are very obvious, you can see those white patches inside the black area. They're very, very obvious. Here, they're very subtle. In fact, a non-radiologist, a non-pulmonologist may not even be able to see them on the second image. And the promise of AI, the promise of digital transformation, given adequate amount of data, doesn't extend only to diagnosing things. There is now an example of a new antibiotic, an entirely new class of antibiotic that is discovered by AI. It's called Helicin, after Hel, the computer in Odyssey, for those of you who like science fiction. But is everything good in AI? I've told you most good things. No. AI by itself will do very little. Our nation is digital at some level, but we need to be more deeply digital. We need to use digital technologies down to the very grassroots. We need a bridge between the people who lead a very, very analog life and our vision of a digital nation. And N. Chandrasekharan, uh, the head of Tata Group, wrote this wonderful book about solving technology's people problem as a digital nation, where digital is used not just as a dream, but as a bridge to people. And I'll not go into details, but we've been using this to solve some real analog problems of surveillance in the field. And the last most important thing is no amount of bias can ever be removed by just throwing it to an AI. If you have an unbiased collection of biased data, the bias is still very much there. The AI will simply learn from your bias, and you might think there is no bias, it's a machine, there is no human bias. Data bias is a very important thing. So in God we trust, all others must bring data. In data we trust, maybe. And many things about AI and activation maps, we need to be careful sometimes. And I won't spend too much time on this. I would rather leave you some time to ask any questions that you might want to ask. But this is a very nice example of Black people were not being identified as high risk by an algorithm that medical insurance companies were using to identify the people who required additional care. Why? Because the proxy of having severe illness was expense on healthcare. Now, obviously, poor people receive less expenditure on healthcare. So if your proxy measure of an AI system is amount of expenditure rise, then clearly poor people receive that care later. And the AI might simply interpret that as saying that the poor person is less sick. Very, very important to keep all these things in mind as we move to a digital transformation with machines handling a large amount of our data, with machines making our prediction. There are a lot of things we need to think about. Beautiful paper, you guys should look at it. There is a Lancet and Financial Times Commission that is cognizant of all these teething problems that this world will have. Growing up in a digital world from the point of view of health futures is going to be a very slippery slope. For every few steps we take forward, we will take a few steps backward. And this is something we want to see convergence of what digital health is really about. Health is the most important part of digital health. Digital transformation for health is still about health, and we must always keep that at the back of our mind. Cool stuff is not always the most useful stuff, and for a country like India with huge divides, that is something we must not forget. And for that reason, I would end by saying this. What should drive the transformation in India? Digital foundations, we have built it with Health Stack, India Stack, Aadhaar, payment interfaces. We now need to bring it for health. Solutions to real problems. It's very easy to solve problems that don't really exist except in the mind of the researcher. There must be input from the health sector. We must always look at value and efficiency. We must do it for inclusivity, not because of fear. Thank you all very much. I think
Thank
I'll
you.
over here.
Thank you very much, sir, for completing your talk within the stipulated time. And that gives me a good amount of opportunity to ask you some of the questions which have been posted by the attendees. I'll take up one by one.
Sure.
So the first one is, I think that is from one of the students, that what kind of platform is being used in telemedicine?
Okay. So telemedicine actually has not a single but multiple platforms. So if you look at the major companies like Cisco, for example, they come out with their proprietary platforms. There are many simple open platforms, and I would say in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, people use something as simple as WhatsApp, which is not advisable. So there are platforms that are free and have complete end-to-end data security. And the best example for India is eSanjeevani. There are platforms that are commercial, and the best example probably is the Cisco platform. And there are many ones in the middle that may have some features, lack other features. Tata has a very nice platform. Tech Mahindra has a very nice platform. Fundamentally, they're all proprietary platforms at this point, apart from eSanjeevani, which is at least partly open. I hope that answered the question.
Okay. Next one is again related to telemedicine, and The question is whether the telemedicine can fully replace the conventional way of medicine in India. If
Absolutely
not,
not.
that's true. If not, then in what way it can actually help the center and the urban and the rural divide in that
Okay.
case?
So the urban-rural divide. Sometimes I used to feel very bad in my OPD when a person came with a 3-hour ride to ask a question that could easily have been answered at a distance. At the same time, I cannot imagine providing full wellness care to a child or to a pregnant mother by telemedicine alone. So there are many situations which are hands-on. You need to touch the patient to be able to make a diagnosis. There are many conditions in which you can spare them the difficulty of coming to a visit. For many of these poor people, a full day spent coming and traveling and going back is loss of wages. And these are something. So basically, it has to be a smart application. Many NCDs, we are seeing complications because we aren't doing follow-ups. Many of the follow-ups don't actually require the patient to come. Only the test needs to be done and the data needs to come. Many of them don't even require a doctor. They only require a program. As long as the parameters are being met, this needs to be done. So a variety of things are possible, including converting national guidelines into simple implementable systems, which are being driven by local health workers. But I will absolutely say telemedicine is not a substitute, not a full substitute for medicine, but a large chunk of medicine. It can aid and will reduce the congestion on our tertiary hospitals.
Okay. What about the accuracy aspect of the telemedicine?
So telemedicine in itself does not necessarily lead to drop in accuracy. So for example, if I am doing an ECG to diagnose an arrhythmia, I've got a good machine on that side. I've got a cardiologist on the other side. The accuracy is not really any different. Now change this to no doctor on this side, only an algorithm on this side. Now the accuracy can drop. Now change it one level further. I don't have a good ECG machine. I only have my Apple Watch. Now the accuracy can drop even further. So there are use case scenarios for all things. An Apple Watch with an AI is optimal for continuous monitoring. No doctor will continuously monitor anybody. A high quality ECG machine, a high quality digital line, and a human cardiologist on the other end is most appropriate for a symptomatic patient on whom a decision has to be made regarding whether cardioversion needs to be done. So these are the ranges. There are many other things in the middle, but these are examples I would give.
Okay. This is regarding the COVID-19,
Mhm.
regarding the RT-PCR results, the accuracy of that. Can you comment on that?
So accuracy comes in two flavors, in sensitivity and specificity. Now, assuming the RT-PCR is technically done correctly, false positive is almost impossible, very low. Typical false positives come from technical problems, contamination of the sample, reading the wrong lane, things like that. Sensitivity is a different problem. Sensitivity of RT-PCR is heavily dependent upon three things: the quality of sample collection, the quality of RNA extraction, and the quality of the PCR kit itself. And we have seen problems with all three. We have seen problems where a sample is not well collected, so you can get false negatives. We have seen many problems where RNA was not extracted properly. And we, of course, know that kits don't necessarily work as well as they should. And even when everything works, sometimes the virus RNA is simply not there in detectable limits, even though the patient may have disease. So the optimal sensitivity of RT-PCR when everything is done perfectly is probably around 85%. Practical sensitivity on the ground, in my opinion, and I'm going to very carefully say my opinion might diverge from other opinions, is probably not more than 60%.
Okay. The next one is again by one of the students. How does exactly the computational biology helps to study the behavior or remedies of the COVID-19?
Okay. So the most important one example I can give you is probably the D614G mutation on the spike protein. So once that mutation was found in the critical area that binds the ACE2 receptor, it was expected that this particular type of virus may have a different uh, spread potential and different infectivity potential and different outcome potential. The outcomes haven't looked very different, but the infectivity seems to be much higher. And all over the world, D614G has replaced the other variants. Now, similarly, let's say that we found one more mutation that made the binding to some other drug better or worse. We could actually do that. So computational biology at a protein structure modeling coupled to genomic data coming from viral genome sequencing could be potentially informative regarding when medications might become ineffective. We already see this sometimes in things like HIV, which are better studied.
Okay. The next one is, can you recommend any upcoming research areas or hot research topics in the area of telemedicines?
I would say telemedicine is a established topic. Once upon a time, a huge area was bandwidth efficiency. How can you use very limited bandwidth to transfer large amounts of data through compression? Today, I would say with 5G around the corner, Reliance Geo all over the country, data costs dropping, I think that's no longer. So my biggest problem is, whatever you feel is hot today, by the time a student actually gets to it, it is becoming less hot. I would strongly recommend to all students, it's chasing your own tail, thinking of hot areas. Hot areas often get populated by the time you get there. And so if you are a final, year just about to apply something, yes, I would say in telemedicine, one of the most important things are noise reductions, personal health devices, home healthcare devices, and analysis of large complex data streams. But I would simply go with your interest and your general understanding of fundamental problems in the field as a better answer.
Okay. The next one comprises of a comment and followed by a question. There is hardly any compilation of health data even in cities. For example, if compilation of COVID could be done state-wise, why not for other diseases in the same time frame is available? What are your views on this?
I agree with you. I
Okay.
mentioned India is supposed to be a data rich nation. We're actually a data poor nation. And I wish it would change.
Okay. So the next one is digitization in COVID-19 pandemic equally good for everyone? How people from rural areas can handle this situation who really don't have any digitized facility freely available?
So this is a very, very interesting question that our commission asks all the time. When is digitization leading us towards universal healthcare? And is a digital technology that does not give universal healthcare bad? I'll take the second one first. Any technology that helps anybody fundamentally is not bad. Soon afterwards, in a few years, it becomes cheap enough to percolate deeper. Now, the trouble is, some of these technologies create a divide. And this socioeconomic divide creates dissatisfaction. And when this technology is very expensive and other people feel compelled to pay for it, it becomes a problem. That's where the role of the government comes in making these advances available cheaply to other people in a relatively short amount of time. And also, I would like to point out, not every new technology is beneficial. The higher income people who are early adopters of these new technologies are also in some sense the guinea pigs of these technology. They are also taking the risks of bad information coming out. To this date, it is not clear that whether having an Apple Watch that can detect an atrial fibrillation event in an otherwise healthy person actually helps you or makes you run around to the cardiologist a bit more. So I think there are huge learning curves. I completely agree with you that not every digitization will lead to universal healthcare. Universal healthcare is the ultimate purpose of what we really want. And we must be cognizant of these problems and try to build bridges, but we must not become Luddites. We must not block the path of digitization and transformation simply because everybody will not get it. Because this question is never ending. America versus India, Delhi versus Agra, Agra versus a small village in Kumaon. These things are never ending. Um, and different sets of people can figure out different parts of the solution.
Sure. The next one is related to reoccurrence of COVID once the person has been tested negative, after they have been tested negative. Can it reoccur in those individuals?
Of course. In fact, if you have never had COVID, you have no likely immunity to it. Well, you might have some, but from baseline, But testing negative for COVID means nothing. You could be positive the day after. In fact, today morning, I was talking to a friend of mine whose cook has tested positive and came back from his village 3 days ago. So today's test is negative, but tomorrow's could be positive because the incubation period is still ongoing. So again, I would recommend to him that he be tested on Monday because the incubation period has a range all the way from 48 hours to 7 days. So today's test told me about the initial incubation period. The test on Monday will tell me about the later incubation period, after which I can tell him to relax. The Indian IPL teams playing in Dubai are undergoing exactly the same protocol. You don't trust a single negative, you keep testing. And you keep testing at a reasonable frequency. And even before they were allowed to enter the Emirates, they underwent 2 tests within India, and they were kept in a biobubble. Then they landed, then they were tested again, and they might get tested twice a week to minimize the transmission.
Okay. The next one is, if in future the AI takes over surgery or treatments, then what will be the scenario in perspective to the doctors and physicians who are currently pursuing their MBBS or MD or something like that?
So, other than a Terminator scenario, there will not be AI taking over anything. Because what you will see is doctors and surgeons who use AI and robotics will displace the doctors who do not use. AI and robotics will not displace doctors. Doctors who use them will displace other doctors. That's the shortest way I can answer that question.
Okay.
Nobody
Okay.
is letting AI run amok anytime soon.
Sure. Sure. Okay. So I'll take up the last two questions now. As COVID-19 belongs to coronavirus, which we know from years, can AI helps us to find out such similar scenario in advance, and which can be cured well in advance, or medicines can be prepared well in advance to
It's a
avoid
really,
a
really
big
important
disaster?
question. And I don't know how many of you know that 5 years ago, there was already a paper talking about a bat coronavirus that was mutated. Yeah, I think it's either a JCI paper or a Nature Medicine paper, but a big journal paper. 5 years ago, talking about a coronavirus strain isolated from bats with mutations, in which the authors are already talking about maintaining a surveillance on bats in China because the next pandemic was going to come from there. And obviously, we didn't learn our lesson then from that paper. So fear will drive a few more lessons. But I always say, fear drives wrong lessons as well as right lessons. Generally speaking, zoonotic diseases, and the next one doesn't have to be a coronavirus, are important to humans. In Bihar, we've been seeing cases of unknown deaths for a long time in the Tarai region. Wherever there are animals and humans are in close contact, and many parts of India have seen these unexplained infections. Africa has seen Ebola, right? I think we need to keep a watch on multiple zoonotic diseases with high amounts of research and to prevent the next pandemic. Simply thinking corona will not get us very far. But this is such an important question that you raise. We must invest in these things.
Okay. So the last question is, there are two parts basically in it. First one is, the integrated medicinal treatment impacts the Ayurvedic way of treatment, particularly in case of the COVID-19. And the second part is, how many cycles of RT-PCR is carried out in deciding the COVID-19 infection?
Okay. The first one is, I am really not an Ayurvedic expert, but the concept of boosting host immunity or modulating host immunity is a very reasonable one. And if indeed any of the Ayurvedic treatments do that successfully, they should be useful in COVID. But I genuinely have no expertise in the matter. The second one about how many cycles, it's a bit kit by kit variation. What we find, and this is our experience, even if the kit says 40, 35 cycles is a better cutoff. Reason being that if you get trace contamination, either during sample collection or anywhere else, you end up getting a lot of false positives because of technical reasons. When CT values are 37, 38, it's very unlikely such people are infectious. So discretion being the better part of valor. If you don't want to get all your healthcare workers who might have got contamination into isolation, CT values of less than 35 are usually called negative. more than 30, sorry, CT values of more than 35 are usually called negative, but I would still go by the kit instructions in the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Agarwal. You finished off the session well in time itself because Dr. Mishra has just joined.
Yes, I see
And
Rakesh.
so it will be a very smooth transition from A to B for me in that case now.
But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir.
And take the leave of everybody.
Sure. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
And
Okay,
welcome,
bye-bye.
Rakesh.
Fine.
Thank
Fine.
you.
Sure.